Maybe the biggest challenge in what I talk about in these videos is what you do with it, right? Certainly a big aspect of it is individual, right? So for me, making these videos, trying to really focus on the two aspects, the two key aspects of what I talk about, which are, thinking better, the Drogo thinking, more rational, more objective, and then the other side, the second component being the mental toughness. So for me, thinking through those things, challenging myself to be better on both accounts, trying to exercise those muscles, build them up, be more reflective and more aware, et cetera, et cetera. All good things. I've seen benefit to that. It appears to be like a never-ending journey that you're working towards. There's no finish line, but there's benefit to my quality of life, my interactions with family and friends, career, et cetera. But beyond that, when you try and take it outside of the individual, when you try and bring it to helping society in some way, not to be too idealistic, it gets tricky. Or you don't even have to go that broad or that big. It's just, how do you help other people? Could be individuals, could be family members, could be friends. How do you try and communicate some of these things because you think it might be helpful? Not in a preachy way, not in a I've got all the answers and I've got it all figured out, but in a, hey, these things might be helpful, it might be useful. And the challenge you run into is that in many ways, it's hard to talk about these things and try and communicate them as if they may be valuable without coming off as either insulting and or arrogant. Because what you're kind of saying to other people is either you're not thinking properly, or you don't have the mental toughness to accept the reality of a situation and actually, address it and be better in some way. And on top of that, I have a better perspective on that than you do, so you should listen to the advice that I'm giving you. And that's challenging. That's really, really challenging, because many people, myself included, still to this day, but historically for sure, that's a tough pill to swallow, right? Like you don't inherently believe like I'm irrational or I'm illogical to whatever degree you may be. You don't necessarily believe I'm not mentally tough. That's not something people want to hear about themselves. And the very nature of it, as we talk about the flaws of the mind and the way in which our mind works, it's the very thing your mind's trying to protect you against. It's the very thing your mind's trying to convince you the opposite of, right? The reason we think irrationally, the reason we often lack mental toughness is because our mind is somewhat deceiving us in that way. So you're really swimming against the tide, if you will, in trying to do that. And from somebody, trying to communicate some of the dynamics or aspects or concepts of this in some way, you also have the struggle of the very nature of it is such that as soon as you become preachy, as soon as you become, you have a degree of certainty, or you try and you're really pushing hard to convince people to listen to what you have to say, it almost directly runs counter to what you're trying to tell them, right? It becomes as if you're not practicing what you preach. So there's challenges on both sides of it, of how do you account for that? How do you deliver this message in a way in which it doesn't, as someone said to me before, it doesn't sweep somebody's legs out. It doesn't make them feel defensive. It doesn't make them feel like you're attacking them in some way. And, when I've tried to do this, when I've had conversations with people, there's also this dynamic that for them to see it, for them to see the value in it, or at least some aspect of it, you have to go through a few layers of it, right? As I mentioned, the mind has some natural defense mechanisms up against these types of things because it's hard, right? That's why the mind's protecting you against it. It's hard. It takes work. It takes energy. It can be painful. It can be uncomfortable. And your mind wants to believe that you don't have to go through that it's okay. So these natural defense mechanisms come up, and to get through those defense mechanisms, you have to probe, you have to question, you have to kind of take people down this path to start to recognize where there might be these inconvenient truths, into the mud, as I often say. You have to identify these areas where maybe they weren't thinking clearly or they weren't exhibiting mental toughness. But again, do it in that very nuanced, soft touch way where it doesn't feel like you're attacking them, where it doesn't make them feel like they need to be on the defensive and on guard in it. Because if you go too soft, if you don't probe enough, you won't get there. right? Their mind will never get to that place. It'll stay in the defensive mode, or in the protective mode, I should say, and they'll never see it. And they'll think, I'm fine. There's no issues here. So if you go too soft, you have that issue. If you go too hard to try and, really get them to see it, well, now they kick into the defensive mode. Now they kick into the, they shut down a little bit, and they don't want to hear it anymore. So this video in many ways is more to illustrate the problem than the solution. A couple thoughts on it, and talking to people, my brother and others, there's some degree of modeling, I think, that helps if it be the change you want to see in the world, right? If you can exhibit it, if you can show it to them, show them what it looks like, show them that you're willing to be vulnerable, you're willing to be humble, you're willing to challenge yourself, it may open the door a little bit. Empathy certainly is a key piece of it, to try and really hear them, to try and really understand them, and really try and learn about who they are and how they think, rather than just passing judgment, rather than claiming to know, certainly helps. Time is a big piece of it. Taking the time. It's not going to happen necessarily in one conversation. You can't expect to speak to somebody, lay out some logic that you think they may be not seeing clearly enough, and that they'll just be like, oh, okay, now I got it. It takes time for their mind to kind of start to adapt into it. And then finally, and perhaps most intuitively, not intuitively, but most obvious from what I talk about here, is I think you have to embrace the mathematical, logical, thinking better, a Drogo way of thinking in how you show it to people. I've talked about this before, that, the figurative numbers don't lie. If you break things down in a logical, mathematical way, not a cold, not an unemotional, not in a way in which you don't account for identity issues and feelings and all that stuff, well, you account for all of that, but you do it logically. You be very mathematical in how you approach it. To some extent, the mind can't hide from that. I did a video recently about, if you were stuck on a mountain and your arm was stuck and you had to cut it off or you were going to die. It's a really interesting hypothetical for someone to think about, because if you weren't willing to cut your arm off, the math is so clear in that you have to cut your arm off. Otherwise, you're going to die, right? It's an obvious choice. But it illustrates how our mind functions, and that it doesn't want discomfort and the hesitation and the inclination to say, I couldn't do it, I couldn't cut my arm off. It shows some, for lack of a better phrase, some degree of like mental weakness, where you're so afraid of that discomfort that you're even considering death instead of it. That's maybe the best pure example of it. But when you break things down mathematically like that and show it in a very logical way, it almost forces people to face the truth to an extent. It doesn't mean they're not going to react defensively. It doesn't mean their mind's not going to try and combat it and turn against it. But that has to be a component of it. So you layer that in with the empathy, with taking time, with modeling it yourself, and I think it's your best shot. But something that is probably the toughest question to answer in this whole thing.